To the days. A request to the audience, kindly keep your mobiles on silent. CSMC is a non-profit organization with a vision to explore the nuances of mythology and folklore from an academic perspective. As CSMC is trying to initiate a dialogue and conversation around various mythic narratives and how they have shaped our civilization. Today's lecture is one such attempt to understand how archaeological findings can shed light on the historical foundations of belief systems. Our President, Dr. Nandkumar, is indisposed at the moment. In his absence, I call upon Advocate Rajiv Shinkre to deliver the welcome address.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all on behalf of the Center for Study of Mythology and Culture. A very warm welcome especially to our guest speaker today, Professor Ravi Korisettar, who is going to deliver a very interesting lecture today. Professor Ravi Korisettar is a national and international authority in the field of archaeology. He currently leads the Robert Bruce Fute Sanganakallu Archaeological Museum in Bellary as the Honorable Director of the museum and serves as an adjunct professor at NIAS Bengaluru. His contributions to the
Advocate Rajiv Shinkre representing for CSMC, dignitaries in the audience, Secretary Education today. We are really honored to have his presence today, Shri Prasad Loliekar sir. Sridhar Kamath is there, Nandkumar Kamath sir, Nirmala Samant is there, and Rajendra Kerkar sir is there with us. So I'm really to see some of the significant dignitaries who have come, specially taking their time out for this lecture. So you can imagine how important this topic is today. Thank you so much for coming in today. So.
With flowers and token of our appreciation. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our chief guest speaker of today's lecture, Professor Korisettar ji, a person of distinction and an erudite scholar. Professor Korisettar ji at University and has retired from Department of History and Archaeology. His research areas are archaeology, art, architecture, museum and heritage studies. He has completed his PhD in prehistory and geomorphology of the Middle Krishna Basin, Karnataka, from Deccan College, Pune University. Post PhD, he has worked on prestigious projects with universities of Karnataka, Pune and Delhi. He has published extensively in journals having high impact factor and has authored 2 international and 5 national books. He is the editor of Current Science, which is a leading science fortnightly journal. He has guided 12 PhDs during his tenure at Karnataka University. He has held several impressive leadership positions as chairman and director of various cells and committees in Karnataka and in other states. He is a member of the state level committee of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, Government of Karnataka.
Respected dignitaries, Havaldarji, Secretary Education, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, Vidyaji, Raju Shinkre, Devaki Shinkre, and dignitaries of the dais and many interested enthusiasts in the prehistory of this particular region. I'm extremely delighted to be here. When the first invitation came from Vidyaji, I was wondering what is this CMSC. And when I asked for the elaboration, she said it's Center for Study of Mythology and Culture. I said how a prehistorian can fit into this particular scheme of thoughts. I was wondering if there is an appendage called culture. And as archaeologists and a prehistorian, we do study culture, but we study evolution of culture and whole time, and we go back to the beginning. And that is where I thought this will be a component of the activities being performed by the Center for Study of Mythology and Culture and so on. So I was very happy to accept the invitation. And I was looking forward to it because the invitation came 2 months ago, and I was wondering why such a time gap between the invitation and the date of lecture and so on. I was trying to organize myself how best I can fit into this particular scheme of activities in this area. And I also was wondering, more than 30 years ago, I initiated prehistoric archaeological research in this area for 2 reasons. Because for a very, very long time, archaeology or prehistory of the entire West Coast was least understood, and there was no focused investigation taking place in any sector of the West Coast, right from Kutch in the northwest of this area to Kanyakumari in the south, because India's coastline is very, very long, but the western coast itself had been posing series of problems in terms of evidence for human occupation of this area. That was one reason. Another reason was that this region of Goa is very much part of the western coast, and there were theories propounded by various archaeologists in the past who suggested that West Coast was an area of isolation. Why this isolation, concept of isolation? Because when in the context of human habitation of a given area, we classify the regions, geographical environment in terms of attraction, areas of attraction, relative isolation and things like that. So one of our pioneers, and whom we regard as father of Indian prehistory, Robert Bruceford, he was the first person to identify the presence for the earliest human settlements anywhere in the Indian subcontinent, way back in 1863. And even though he found some artifacts or stone tools which were definitely made by man in the past, he was not very sure until he found more of them. And then in 1866, he came out with the first publication on his findings, and that heralded the beginning of scientific literature in the archaeologists' effort to reconstruct the cultural evolution of the Indian subcontinent. Who were the first settlers, when they came, and what were their strategies to successfully adapt to various geographical environments across a huge subcontinent and so on. And then he was of the opinion that West Coast was inhospitable for 2 reasons. One, environmentally, it is densely forested, and another component of environment was the availability of suitable rocks for making stone tools. So his knowledge of geology, and he thought that basalts, which occupy a major part of the Western Deccan, including some parts of Goa, were not suitable for making stone artifacts. And then the landscapes were not favorable. Dense forest ecosystems were generally avoided by early human hunter-gatherers and so on and so forth. But this remained untested for a very, very long time. And occasional reports of evidence for early human occupation from different sectors of the West Coast were coming now and then, but there was no convincing documentation about the significant presence of humans along the West Coast and so on. Why I thought we should identify sectors along the West Coast and then carry out intensive surveys. And Goa was least known in terms of prehistoric settlements. There were occasional reports from the archaeologists working for the Archaeological Survey of India, but they were reporting one or two stone tools which were suspected to be stone tools made by early man and so on and so on. So there was this document. But as we come upwards, later periods like Mesolithic period, and then we have Megalithic period and early historic period, and historical processes have left behind vestiges across this entire landscape. But what was important for us is to, as archaeologists, as persons who are curious to know why some areas have been identified as isolated areas. So it was necessary to select, although sometimes it leads to frustration because you work for 2 to 3 years on a defined program and with a designed research project, but then if nothing is brought to light, you are highly frustrated. But anyway, it was worth taking chance. And since there were already some clues, we thought we should take up some parts of Goa and then initiate. And then another reason why I was very happy to accept the invitation was when we were working there, me and my student, we were reporting the presence of early man, sites in this area. I did make popular articles in the newspapers here, now in the Times and so on, but the response was not coming from the educated commoner or even archaeologists who were already here. I was little wondering why this is the situation. So I thought I should grab this occasion and then come back, hit your minds, to make think about, this is not an area of isolation. It has a lot of information in store, but what needs to be done is to probe into these landscapes, identify the presence or even absence is also an answer to questions we address. So that is where I thought I should come and accept and spend some time for interaction with you and so on. Gathered more than 30 years ago is not a large body of data. So I thought we should place the evidence against the entire West Coast. So look at the West Coast as a distinctive geographical area. In terms of environment, in terms of climate, in terms of natural resources and so on. Although it is a continuous landscape, the resource base is not uniform all along. See, and that is where we thought, this region has certain geological formations. Since 1866 to with more than 150-60 years, we have identified the factors which govern the a settlement of a particular area. Maybe Paleolithic times, we call it Old Stone Age, where humans were very primitive hunter-gatherers and so on. And then later time period where man had become an advanced hunter-gatherer, then he becomes an agriculturist, then he becomes a person who is establishing larger societies. From simple societies to larger societies, development was taking place and so on. So we should be able to trace them, so that this area will present the nature of evidence across the entire West Coast. And we know East Coast has been very, very productive in terms of prehistoric archaeological research, and also advancement in the way in which we have been able to reconstruct the way in which early human settlements came up along the East Coast and in the inland areas and so on. But what is required is, in order to emphasize that even these areas are equally important, and if archaeologists design projects that will help in initiating intensive surveys and look into those areas which have been identified as most isolated in terms of the local geography, and see if we can also bring to light clear evidence and also establish the development in a chronological framework and so on. So with this brief background, I would like to run through have now been looked at as an important mechanism for biocultural evolution. So this migration means what? We have to originate somewhere and then traverse across and settle down, and then again traverse across and settle down and so on. So this is what we call peopling of the world. Now the Indian subcontinent is part of the old world. This map gives you an idea of the old world, which means the Asia, Europe and Africa. Because these three contiguous continental areas have preserved evidence for the earliest human settlements. Whereas Australia and the Americas and some islands, across the oceans within the larger ocean areas are still uninhabited for various, reasons. But these three areas have given evidence for development of humans biologically and culturally continuously over the last 2 million years or even more. Now we know that this biocultural evolution began some 33 lakh years ago. And so where it began and when it began, and these two questions find answers in the African archaeological record. So where we think that the oldest human settlements and the earliest stages of human biological evolution are also very well documented in African archaeological sites, especially in Eastern Africa, in the Rift Valley, and further south in Southern Africa and so on. And this map gives you an idea that African sites are the oldest, and I should also tell you, we are dealing with people who did not have a written language, and so pre-literate societies. So if they were literate people, they would have left a record consciously. But here the situation is very, very different, and the prehistoric period extends over much longer time. Suppose 99% of human existence on this earth is prehistoric period, and only 1% is historical period where human societies are literate and so on. So here, in order to answer these base questions, historical questions like who were the first settlers here, when they came, what were their lifeways, and such similar questions of how they were able to successfully adapt to a particular region. These are all questions we have to answer, but there is no written record. So the archaeological record is addressed through multidisciplinary investigations. In the beginning, we were only dealing with stone tools and other kinds of vestiges which were made by man and utilized and discarded. They were not left behind consciously. And then they happen to become part of the surface and subsurface, and then they gradually, get converted into an archaeological record. And when we go there, we look at these vestiges, and we also look for or search for the people who made them and so on. But we don't know when they made, who made them and so on. So we identify them on the basis of typical types of stone tools or typical types of artifacts, artifacts which were made. So any object which was first invented by our ancestors identifies them. So for example, in Africa we have sites called Lometrian sites. There are not many, but there are 1 or 2 sites where stone tools only have been found, and they have been dated to 3.3 million years. So until this was dated to 3.3 million years, Olduvai Gorge in Kenya was considered the oldest site, going back to 2.6 million years. So these investigations, if they continue, uninterrupted, they add to newer and newer insights and finding new evidence, and then our understanding gets revived and so on. So the similar sites outside of Africa are much younger. They are younger, around 2 million years, 1.5 million years, 1 million years, and so on and so forth. So the earliest settlements from one region to another region in these 3 continents has given us a clear picture of the fact that Africa was the center of human evolution, Africa was the center of cultural evolution, and it was from Africa humans began to migrate, and this migration led to colonization of newer geographical areas. And once they colonized the new area, the area was productive in the sense it was supporting their lifeways through their natural resources. Man was successful because he was innovative, he could make suitable tools, and in order to extract plant food, animal food and things like that, and that was enabling people to settle down. And then if climates were going extreme in terms of long-term glacial periods, arid cold conditions, and in terms of interglacial, in terms of warmer humid conditions, the natural environment was also accordingly changing. So he had to find new tools, and he was exposed to dearth of resources during cold and dry periods, and abundant resources during warm and humid phases. So accordingly, new technology was contributing to producing new types of stone tool and so on. So this becomes an archaeological record, and we begin to see that new migrating people were not remaining in one particular region for a very, very long time, because demographic pressures were always there, environmental constraints were always there. So when he was challenged by these natural processes, he would move into a new area which is relatively more productive and so on. That is how migrations were taking place, and they entered into Northern Asia, Central Asia, South Asia and Eastern Asia, and then of course towards northwest of Africa into Europe and so on. But then, as I said, when we use these modern dating techniques, we have established that the earliest settlements outside of Africa are much younger, and also the first appearance of earliest and human ancestors who were capable of making stone tools and the earliest settlements outside of Africa, there is not much time gap. In this sense, 2 million years is not a big time gap when we look back into geological time periods. So by about 2 million years ago, we see that human migrations began to take place, and humans exited Africa and began to colonize and so on. So for a very, very long time, until about 70,000 years ago, our earliest ancestors were spreading across these three continents, and then about 70,000 years ago, there was biological evolution gave rise to what we call modern humans, or Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors. And these human ancestors were even much more advanced, and these people were capable of seafaring, cutting across large water bodies, making use of changes in the climate and changes in the sea levels, and then move across vast areas, and then they began to colonize Australia and then Americas and so on. By about 12,000 years ago, peopling of the world more or less was complete. Even today, expansions are going on, but then the initial process of colonizing the areas which were not previously colonized were established as human settlements, that is the Americas, northern, where we have archaeological sites going back to 60,000 years in Australia and 13,000 to 15,000 years in Northern America, and then further south by about 10,000 years ago, Latin American sites and so on. There are of course issues being debated whether it is earlier than 13,000, earlier than 15,000 and all that, but this can be resolved through scientific study and so on. So this is what we are also looking at. These arrows indicate the trajectories or the paths of dispersal of the early humans. So in prehistory, we have two major expansion events. There were many more, but major expansion events. The first one around 2 million years ago is associated with what we call Homo erectus or Homo habilis. Homo habilis largely confined to Africa, and they produce such stone tools which we call choppers. They are called Oldowan tools. So that was the earliest evidence, and we call the makers as Homo habilis, because Homo is man, the tool maker, and habilis capable of making tools. But now, as I said in the beginning, we have ancient sites in Africa itself going back to 33 lakh years, but then there is no direct evidence of the stone tools associated with the makers. But contemporary human ancestors are now recognized as Australopithecines. Australo means south, Pithecines means ape. So these were not considered as tool makers, and that is why Homo habilis was considered the first tool maker. But the Australopithecines are now credited for initiating this step to modify natural pieces of stone into cutting tools which can be helpful in cutting and so on. So the Lomekwian has been identified as the earliest stone tools, and the contemporary human ancestors are what we call Australopithecines like Kinianthropus platyopes, and then Australopithecus africanus and so on and so forth. But still, they are not occurring together like habilis and Oldowan tools and so on. So and then following a successful adaptation by the Homo habilis, biological evolution led to the rise of Homo erectus. Homo erectus was the first human ancestor discovered in Indonesia by Eugene Dubois, and a French dentist who was residing in Indonesia, Java. He discovered in 1890, 91, that period, but later they found similar human fossils in Africa. They happen to be older than those found in Indonesia. So this dating is very, very critical to establish the patterns of movement and the processes, cultural processes leading to human expansion beyond Africa and so on. So that is Homo erectus is also known. Erectus means bipedal, upright posture with free four hands, four limbs, and capable of manipulating natural pieces. Hit one stone with another and produce a sharp cutting edge, and that helps you to dig down and break the bones of animals. Grab carcass, animal meat from carcass and so on, because he had to compete with other predators to grab animal meat from carcass and so on. So these tools were very, very effective. And when these tools enabled him to procure a lot of animal meat, that also added animal protein into human diet, and that led to what we call encephalization, enlargement of the brain. And a smaller brain gradually develops to larger and larger, and we have from 450 cc to now we have almost 1600 cc brain size and so on. So this is a biological evolution, and then anatomical features also changed. The earliest human ancestors would be compared to modern day chimpanzees and so on, with long hands and short legs, knuckle walking, and able to run fast and these kind of things. So that tool making gave them greater strength and access to diverse varieties of plant and animal foods, and that led to biological evolution as well. And complex functions could also be performed. And so new type of stone tools were produced, and this Homo erectus is credited for the invention of what we call hand axes and cleavers, which I will show you. And these tools are found in these three continents. Outside Africa is the sites represented by hand axes and cleavers, and the authors of these hand axes and cleavers are Homo erectus. So from Homo erectus till about 300,000 years ago, the biological evolution was largely confined to Africa, and that is where our human ancestor Homo sapiens also evolved. And for a long time, he was spreading, colonizing other parts of Africa. And around 70,000 years ago, he moved northwards into the region north of the rainforest area into southern Europe and Southwest Asia, and then spread across. And at this point of time, these Homo sapiens encountered Neanderthals in Europe, another human ancestral group which was well adapted to European cold climate, and then the Denisovans. Denisova is a cave in Siberia where in the last 20 years they found evidence for a very different type of human ancestor. We call human any fossil as a human because they were capable of making tools. So that is cultural behavior. So Denisovans, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, so they met. You see that migration, as I said, that was contributing to meeting different contemporary communities who were well adapted to different geographical environments. They lived together for tens of thousands of years. They interbred, and then amongst these three, in the last 100,000 years, our ancestors survived, and then the other two literally became extinct. We don't have any evidence, but it is reflected in the genetic study. There's an area called archaeogenetics, which also helps us understand human biological evolution through study of DNA. And contemporary population living anywhere in the world have a share of DNA from Neanderthals, a share of DNA from Denisovans and so on. If you go to Eastern Asia and then Southeast Asia, we see greater component of Denisovan gene in those populations. In us, in Indians, we have 2 to 3% of Neanderthal genes in us, and in fact, when Corona was, threatening the survival of humanity, the proneness to Corona was detected because of the presence of Neanderthal gene in all of us. So, however, we have successfully overcome this threat. So this interaction, now we have lived together, we have interbred, and then the most successful are our ancestors, and we are the only human community living on the earth. We don't have a competitor. Our competitors are the predators or whatever. So that is how we trace these human expansions in terms of two major events, out of Africa 1 and out of Africa 2, and we all belong to out of Africa 2 expansion of human ancestors, and we have colonized the entire planet and even going beyond our planet and so on. And as I said, the time scales that we are dealing with, you can just see here on the left hand column and the right hand column, the entire last 2.6 million, now we may have to go back to 3.3 million years, but the consistent and continuous uninterrupted archaeological records belong to this time period, which we call Pleistocene and then Holocene. The last 10,000 years is called Holocene, and then 2.6 million years ago to 10,000 years ago we call Pleistocene, which is again subdivided based on geological and other kinds of evidence into early Pleistocene or lower Pleistocene, middle Pleistocene and late Pleistocene. Early and middle Pleistocene witnessed the emergence of Homo, and then middle Pleistocene we see the descendants of Homo erectus in terms of Homo heidelbergensis. Heidelbergensis giving rise to Neanderthals, Heidelbergensis giving rise to Homo sapiens, and we still do not know who gave rise to Denisovans. That research is still going on. And so Homo sapiens are the ones which evolved around 300,000 years ago and expanded out of Africa when they had invented a new type of stone tool called microliths, backed microliths. They are very 4 centimeter long, small parallel sided blades with various types and forms. We call them geometric forms, we call them points, lunates, trapezoids, triangles and so on. And they were not used individually, they were hafted. They were used as composite tools, they were used for tipping the arrow, and these people were capable of exploiting aquatic resources, water bodies, inland water bodies, ocean, coastal area, and so on. So they had this access to new technology. Although microliths, when compared to the tools which were produced earlier, are very, very small, diminutive, and look very miserable. And for a long time it was thought a degeneration. But then when archaeological research was carried out in a multidisciplinary perspective, they said yes, this was an adaptive strategy, and they invented these microliths in order to successfully adapt and expand over much more larger geographical areas. So microlithic invention around 80 to 90,000 years ago enabled our ancestors to spread across Africa, move northwards into Southwest Asia or Middle Asia, and then they were also successful in colonizing coastal belts. See, that is where I thought these coastal regions across the old world should be potential for identifying the paths of dispersal and the way in which these microlithic people were capable of colonizing to what we have in Africa, or we have evidence which is much younger. And if it is equally old, what were similarities between African environment and Indian coastal environment? If there is a time gap between African and Indian, what were the environmental deterrents that came in the way of early expansion of microlithic people? Why did they not come to coastal areas? Why they went inside the interior of the Indian subcontinent, and so on and so forth? So this microliths were invented. For a very long time, these microliths were thought to have been invented by Mesolithic people. Post-glacial, what we call the last ice age, came to an end around 13,000 years ago. And the global climate, like we enjoy today, came into existence around 13,000 years ago, and we still continue to enjoy. And we even anticipating more warmer and humid conditions, and we have experienced a heavy monsoon this year, unusual monsoon. It's all because of warming conditions. So whether this archaeologists thought that microliths were an invention to adapt to end of the glacial climate and the coming into existence the entirely different environment like we see today. During ice ages, major part of the continental area was covered by ice. Sea levels were very, very low, at least 150 kilometers away from where it is today. And the land continental area is much wider along the western coast or eastern, along the coastal areas, And then the rainfall affected, the distribution of rainfall affected the vegetation, association along the west coast and so on. So these had to be looked at and see. Some people argue that yes, the continental shelf has submerged many older sites and so on. But then we had to look at the west coast geomorphology much more carefully and then see if these theories are valid or not and so on. So these time scales help us, figure out how at different points of time, different regions of the world were supporting the incoming populations from outside, and how the ecosystems themselves were, enabling the sustenance of the life phase of the people and so on. So as you can see here, the peninsular coast is very, very long, 5,400 and odd kilometers. If you include the coastline of the Andaman island and so on, it will increase more than 7,000 years. But this continuous coastline, west coast and east coast, nearly 5,400 kilometers. And there is a differential distribution of early settlements, Stone Age settlements. And and from Kutch to Kanyakumari, that is our focus today, we see that the evidence for human settlements in some parts of the west coast is very, very old, and in major part of west coast is much younger, and so on and so on. Why is this differential, and what were the factors governing this differential distribution of ancient early Stone Age settlements along the west coast and so on? So the documented evidence is inadequate, and whether it is true, because this documentation is based on the force, archaeological force that is working in a particular area. If the force is very small, naturally many areas are left unsurveyed. So there are blanks. Whether they are blanks because there were no settlements, or there are blanks because the areas have not been surveyed. And these are some of the challenges we face. And the type of tools that we have found in some parts of the west coast are these typical stone tools. We call it a biface. This is a biface hand axe made from a type of rock known as quartzite. And this quartzite played a very presence of quartzite played a very important role in attracting human populations, because the environment is favorable. But if the lithics, they made stone tools to be able to adapt. And if the stone that they use for making tools is not hard enough, the tool is of no use to them. Instead of performing a function, it breaks itself and it is put to use. So the use of hard rock and a fine-grained rock and a rock which gives conchoidal fracture. That is, when we study rock mechanics, if the stone rock has hardness 7 and it gives conchoidal fracture when it is struck with a hammerstone, that can lead to tractable rock, we call. So such large cutting tools, although we call it a hand axe or a cleaver, they are otherwise called large cutting tools. They were made from blocks of quartzite, cobbles of quartzite, or large flakes even detached from outcrops and so on. So large Acheulean, large flake cleavers and things like that. So this type of tools have been found in some parts of west coast. If one area of west coast gives an evidence of this kind, why we do not find all along the west coast? So this is our archaeologist problem. So that's one reason I said that these coastlines have although it is a coastline all along, the shelf area varies in terms of width and depth and also steepness and so on, and also in terms of geological cover of the continental shelf. So some argue that in the shelf one may find archaeological sites of the Stone Age, but still it is a very far-fetched idea, but possible. But in southern Africa they have found some submerged Acheulean lower Paleolithic tools. So they said in other areas also it should be possible. It cannot be ruled out. But then, as you can see, it's narrow in the Kutch and Saurashtra area, widens up to about 80 kilometers, and then again narrows down, it becomes steep, and then it is all covered by laterite. The continental shelf floor is covered by different geographical formations, and laterite is the youngest of all the Precambrian rocks here, post-basaltic, which is about 60 million years ago, and this is a weathered soil and fossilized soil. So it is called laterite. It has a typical profile, and the best profiles one can see of any laterite is the Mahabaleshwar Plateau. But then all along, you drive anywhere in this particular region, you see widespread presence of laterite. So laterite has sealed the various types of rocks which were suitable for making stone tools. But it is not that it has completely sealed it, but there are areas where it opens up, and then older rocks are also exposed to. And so this length of the coastlines here, and then the early research along the west coast in terms of search for early man sites began in 1930s. The KRU Todd colonel, he was the pioneer. He surveyed Kandivali Nala in Mumbai area and identified some evidence of stone tools along the Kandivali Nala, but he could not find more sites. And the way Mumbai has developed for the last 100 years, all these, if they were there, have been completely lost or buried or turned down, up and down and so on. But anyway, the pioneer happens to be KRU Todd in this area. And prior to that, Robert Brusford, who also was invited by the Maharaja Gaikwad to initiate geological survey of the Gaikwad province, he surveyed Mahi and Sabarmati valleys. In the lower reaches, he also reported the presence
Is it 1894? 1984 or 1894?
Sorry. Yeah, 1894. Yeah. So he reported them, but then Todd's work was, but then subsequent surveys did not produce more evidence of what Todd has reported. His collections are in the Romano-British Antiquities section of the British Museum, but there are definitely tools. That is what we know from experts who followed Todd's work in Mumbai area. It was Sanklia, it was S.C. Malik and several others, including environmental archaeologists by name Zoiner and so on. But then Sanklia's work in Kutch area, in fact, laid the foundations for the discovery of earliest stone tools in Kutch areas. And if you come from the northwestern most part of the west coast, we have the Kutch region, which has really produced wonderful evidence belonging to the last 2 million years time period. And Sankliya students by name Ansari and Poppu, they revisited some of the sites which were reported by Sankliya, and they substantiated the discoveries made earlier. And so then there were these sites which we call early Stone Age sites, and then in addition to that they also found Middle Stone Age, subsequent stage in the development of Stone Age. And in the last 15-20 years, the rise of interest in the way in which modern humans colonized South Asia, these are critical geographical areas, because there is a theory that modern humans, Homo sapiens, exited Africa and moved along the coast and colonized Australia, South Asia, and then went beyond Indonesia, Australia, ultimately Australia, and so on. So to test that, so the nature of evidence was very, very important. In the coastal Kutch area, there are some sites which have been reported by the joint expeditions carried out by archaeologists in England, also in India, and they reported the presence of Middle Paleolithic tools and also Upper Paleolithic tools. So evidence that some part of the coast we was witnessing movement of the people. But if the same story is repeated in the Saurashtra region or not, one needs to be testing. So of course, in 1890, Sankliya's work was again carried forward by students of archaeology in Deccan College, and A.R. Manate, he initiated a survey of Saurashtra, especially the miliolites. These are foraminifera deposits, deposited by the sea, which was transgressing as well as regressing, encroaching the Saurashtra inland areas during high sea levels and withdrawing and then exposing the Saurashtra landscape and so on. So during the process of transgression and regression, they left behind some of these microfossils as deposits. These are called miliolites. So these miliolite cycles are now, they sandwich what we call river gravels. So when archaeologists look for archaeological sites, Stone Age sites, they follow the river courses and then the gravel bodies. And because gravels have ready-made nodules and cobules and so on, so they were readily available for modifying them into stone tools and so on. So the Kalubar River, Kiran Valley, Bhadar Valley, and several rivers which originate in the central highlands of Saurashtra, they go into the radiate. There is a radial drainage, and these rivers have also cut through these limestone meteorite formations, exposing the gravels. So Maratha's survey resulted in the discovery of stone tools of the Paleolithic in the gravels below and above the meteorite formation and so on. And these meteorites are carbonate-rich foraminifera. They could be dated by uranium series dating method, and at that point of time, they dated them to about 4 lakh years or so. But now we suspect that there are better methods, more high resolution dating methods, which can help us push back the age of these early Stone Age sites even in Saurashtra and so on. And then we come to Konkan. Konkan has been a bone of contention among archaeologists. They say there are sites and there are no sites. But then there are sites, no doubt. Now we are very clear. In the 1970s, Dr. Statira Gazdar carried out a detailed study of the southern part of Konkan area, Ratnagiri and Sindhudurg, those regions. And she was able to report the presence of Stone Age tools, but they were again associated with quartzitic rocks, which are part of what we call, in some books we call it Vindhyan formation, in some other books they call it Kadapa formation, but actually they are inland Kaladgi basin in northern Karnataka. It's an outlier entering into the western coast in the southern Konkan region. Fonda and those areas, there are these quartzite formations. These are proterozoic formations, about 1.5 billion year old formations. So they have these quartzites. So Dr. Wadia was able to identify the presence, but the evidence is not rich. But yet there is evidence for human presence in those areas. And little later, some of the lateritic caverns, caves in lateritic areas in the Konkan region, like Pachad and other areas, were also identified by Deccan College archaeologists. They found evidence for human presence in terms of microliths and so on. And about 20 years ago, again, A.R. Marathe went into Konkan area and he excavated one lateritic cave site called Sursundi, where he reported the presence of early Stone Age. But this is not consistent throughout the, as we saw, that is a long belt, coastal belt called Konkan belt. So that is the story, the region north of Goa. And then the same formations continue in the western Ghats of Goa. We have again exposed what we call dharwars in early geological literature, but they are now called greenstones, and these greenstones also have quartzite formations. Very early, what we call Precambrian quartzites are found in these, and that is one advantage for archaeologists, to go back and see. So in the 60s, Sali of ASI, who was based, was stationed here in Goa. He surveyed these Dudhsagar area and so on. He reported 1 or 2 pieces of what he called little Paleolithic tools and so on. And then microlithic tools were found in different parts. And later on, Rajguru and Shishmadev began to look at some of these formations in the western coast. And the rivers like Juari and Mandovi were taken up by students of Professor S. N. Rajguru at Deccan College to understand the geomorphological processes and understand the way in which the landscapes have evolved in response to denudational processes, and also in response to movement of the land area up and down or whatever. So we have these areas very potential for understanding, like meteorites were giving clues to the advancement and regression of the sea levels. Other sectors of the West Coast were also to be examined to document evidence for sea level changes and so on. So this is a multidisciplinary endeavor was going on. So as I said, Sali was the pioneer in this region to report the presence of stone tools of the Middle Paleolithic. And these clues were taken up by us, as I said right in the beginning, while we came to this area. And then the southern Goa region, because of its geological formations, were found to be very, very potential. So we initiated surveys in the Dudhsagar and its tributaries and began to document the evidence, because we had an experience of having worked in different parts of Gujarat, Saurashtra, Kutch, and then other parts of Konkan. So we thought we have learned some lessons, how to look for Stone Age sites, and let us put it to practice and so on. And we were very fortunate. We were not frustrated. we added many more sites and we added many more stone artifacts belonging to early Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, and then of course there are gaps in the way in which the succession has been documented in other areas. We don't have clear evidence for Upper Paleolithic, but abundant evidence for Mesolithic, Microlithic sites, which I will gradually show you. So some of these, references that I have given help us, that yes, the idea of an area of isolation, it may not be valid the way it was, because there was a time. So like, these are the regions where we found large number of, in Kutch area, Paleolithic tools have been found. We have these lower Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic and microlithic tools distributed. It does not mean these are the only sites there, but there are, areas which can also be subject to further survey and we may fill the gaps. It is not necessary that the entire Kutch area should produce evidence of these, ancient Stone Age sites and so on. But at least this geographically, very arid region today was favorable for humans to colonize and then, move across this area. And these are typical tools found from Kutch. These are called bifaces or hand axes made from typical quartzitic rock which occurs in different parts of Kutch in geological formations and so on. And they are the ones diagnostic of the presence of Stone Age sites in different parts of India. And then, as I said, that these middle Paleolithic tiles sites and also upper Paleolithic sites in Kutch area have been recently found. They are not only found in the coastal Kutch but also in the inland regions of Rajasthan. So this effort to document is in understand how Homo sapiens dispersed into the Indian subcontinent, whether they came along the coast or through inland routes and so on. So you see these sites distributed across different regions, but when we come to this region, the presence of these middle and upper Paleolithic sites are very, very sparse. And then we get this kind of middle Paleolithic tools in Kutch area, but not in coastal Gujarat or Konkan area. But there are one or two sites which also give us the evidence for the middle Paleolithic. But then needs to be looked at these sites much more carefully, because if we had to designate these sites as middle or upper Paleolithic, we need evidence from more than one site and so on. And some of the clues, like the ones I'm showing here, give us hope that future research may add to many sites in this area. And then we come to this particular phase of microliths. As I said, in Africa, they go back to 80,000-90,000, but here we find them in Kutch area, in Saurashtra area. They are made from different types of stones. We call them called chalcedony, agate, jasper. They are called high quality. They are glassy, vitreous in nature. When broken, they are very, very sharp. It may even cut your fingers. That kind of sharpness they have because they are glassy texture. So these sites are contributing to a better understanding of expansion of modern humans, Homo sapiens, into different parts of Kutch area and so on. And then we also find this type of tool. What we can see here, this has a tank. So this is hafted. This is hafted into long shaft. So it's much like a missile. So an advancement in technology, in hunting strategies. So these upper Paleolithic, late Paleolithic people were, large game, big game hunters, and they were more efficient in hunting strategies and so on. And they produced entirely different types. So these tanged kind of shouldered points we call, they are found in Africa, in Northern Africa, and also in several sites in India as well. And other kinds of bifacial tools, scrapers, points, and blades and so on. These are very common. And then we have these in Saurashtra. There are sites. These are some of the sites we have plotted here. The best example comes from this place called Adichadina Wow in Junagadh Hills, where this is the kind of the miliolite formation, and below here there is a gravel body, and this gravel body yielded artifacts of this type. It's a very rare thing, and one had to be very courageous and adventurous to go deep into these water bodies and then look at the gravels carefully while swimming and then extract these kind of stone tools. So these miliolites could be dated, and below this meteorite is the gravel, which contains, means older than the meteorite, and 3 lakh, 4 lakhs age that they have now determined, but they are likely even older, because our earliest settlement in India goes back to 1.5 million years. And so these were the days when we did not have the modern dating techniques. So if we go back and reinvestigate and apply modern dating techniques, we will surely be able to figure out how old they are and so on. So these are some of the sites which are distributed in inland area. But then the Hiran Valley, to the mouth, in the mouth of the Hiran Valley, we have exposures where we have found Middle Paleolithic tools associated with gravel bodies and so on. So this is one such gravel body, and this gravel body contains cobbles and pebbles of quartzite and so on. And they were used for making this kind of large cutting tools called hand axes and so on, and including what we call Middle Paleolithic flake tools. And the site of Sursundi was excavated by A.R. Marathe. He found this kind of tools. It's not so clear evidence, but yet there is these pieces of stone do give us evidence of human workmanship. The shape is not natural; it is an artificial shape. So, it's a lateritic cave, and they excavated in this area and found these kind of tools. We don't know the age of these, but we still know. What we know is these caves in the Konkan region were colonized or occupied by human ancestors. And then in Malvan area, when Dr. Wadia was working, she was focusing on these outliers of Kaladgi quartzitic formations, and she found on the surface scatter some of these types of Middle Paleolithic flake tools with sharp edge and so on, cutting edge, and then flakes with scraping edge and so on. So this evidence is not abundant, but now in the last 20 years, more and more sites are being reported, and an additional body of evidence in the form of art, like what we call geoglyphs, are also being brought to light, and then numerous hundreds of microlithic sites are also brought to light. So that is what we see. These are typical. I'm not getting into many of the examples. Just an example, one example which shows the geoglyphs that have been identified in the Konkan region. There are 80, 90 or even 100 sites now in the last 3-4 years. So this is not unique to Konkan. Long before these were identified in the Konkan area, the southern Goa region was the first region where such geoglyphs were reported. Unfortunately, it did not attract attention of many interested archaeologists, but they remain to be of interest of amateur archaeologists, and then passing references to their presence. But their context was not clear. Even today, their context is not clear. But when we look at it from the perspective of an art execution, we have certain basic requirements. If this is hard rock, laterite is a very hard, indurated stuff. It cannot be manipulated with simple stone tools, and then it is not suitable for cultivation of food crops. We can only cultivate horticultural crops and so on. So how this kind of rock surface was utilized by man, and what was the technique behind, and gives you some clues. Perhaps these are all not older than Iron Age and so on. So then, given this background, we would like to look at these particular questions, like who were the terms of the age. It is now possible. 30 years ago, when we were surveying, there was no scope for establishing chronology. And where from they came, because I said migrations played an important role, whether they came from upland area or they were moving along the coastal tracts and then settled down at some point which were favorable for human settlement and so on. And what was the nature? What is the nature of evidence? Like I have shown you, we do get evidence of early Stone Age hand axes, cleavers, and then the Middle Stone Age flake tools. Not enough evidence about Upper Paleolithic, but abundant Mesolithic and then Iron Age sites and so on. So what are the timelines? I said it goes back to 2 million years more than 2 million years in Africa, and now we have dates for earliest settlements going back to 15 lakh years in southeast coast at Athirampakkam, and 12 lakh years in northern Karnataka at a site called Visampur. So there are typological similarities, technological comparability suggests that yes, even these early Stone Age sites in Goa or anywhere along the west coast could be as old as what we have in the east coast. So this cannot be ruled out. So that, but we need a context to establish firmly at that particular site. Otherwise, generally, human colonization of the Indian subcontinent took place 1.5 million years ago or even earlier, possible. And the routes of migration are very important. And if you follow the routes, suggested routes identified by archaeologists as we go northwest, they will likely to be older. And in Pakistan today, we have some sites which go back to 2 million years or so. But then these tool types are different in different geographical environments and so on. So the geological formations, which I briefly mentioned, the most important requirement for archaeologists or prehistorians is the presence of tractable raw material. I said it should be siliceous limestone, it should be quartzite, it should be sandstone, it should be chert, again jasper and things like that. So these are very hard rocks, and high quality rocks are also there. And if they are present here, we narrow down our search. We go to those areas where such rock outcrops are there, either in the form of rock outcrops or in the form of pebbles and cobbles in the river lake deposits or alluvial fans along the escarpment flow, base of the Western Ghat escarpment and things like that. So that is where we were successful when we began to look for similar sites in the Dudh region. They were associated with the alluvial fans. They have been reported as the river gravels, no doubt, but when we understand the landscape evolution, we know that they are not necessarily laid by the rivers, but by the slope retreat processes. Escarpment, is withdrawing, going, backwards. So that gives rise to cobbles and mass wasting activity, and they are deposited at the base, foot of the escarpment and so on. And at the same time, the drainage, there are 3 major rivers here. Of course, Mandovi and Zoari are the 2 major rivers, and their tributaries. They all originate in the plateau here. They flow eastwards, follow the general trend of the landscape slope, and then other processes which are governed the nature of drainage here. But as I said, archaeologists would like to follow the rivers because the exposures are along the banks of the rivers. We always thought it is easy, but now we know that you don't have to follow only the river courses. Go into inland areas, locate such places where raw material resources are there, you are likely to find if they are there. And the drainage generally is an important aspect of our survey plan. But in addition to that, we go away from the rivers into the foothill areas. And then as you can see here, we have these sites in the it may not be exactly upper reaches because upper reaches is in the Western Ghats. But as it comes down, we call it middle reaches, and we have these 3 or 4 sites where typical hand axes and cleavers have been found. So these different divisions, earlier subdivisions and modern subdivisions and so on. The sites which were located in a district which was much larger, now the sites are redistributed in a new district, separating the larger into 2 or something like that. But anyway, North Goa is yet to be systematically surveyed, whereas Southern Goa has received considerable attention, but it requires continuous effort. And these are some of the tools which we found along these rivers, like we have Sonwal, and then Kollam and Sigao, Bimbal, Tamdi Surla, and Kurdi, and Niranchal and Kazur. These are 8 sites we were able to discover. But these were not known previously. Only later period, Little Paleolithic and then occasional Mesolithic sites were known. So this was the one which we could add to the archaeological database for this particular region. And then as we moved away from the foothill areas towards the coastal tracts, upland, promontories and so on, what we saw was dense occurrence of Mesolithic sites. And in addition to that, we have these lateritic caves. And one of the caves was very potential. We also investigated there. And these are some of the gravels exposed in the riverbed today. And they are considered as river deposits. But they are not actually river deposits. They are the colluvial gravel fans, and which are now exposed by the modern day drainage. So this understanding we could. And what they have done, surfaces which were previously exposed were occupied by humans. They made use of these cobbles and pebbles, made this kind of tools, and then geomorphological processes buried them, and then later channel incision, what we call in the last 10 to 15,000 years, has cut down the deposits that was capping these formations, and this surface is now here and there you begin to get evidence of stone tools and so on. A close-up of one of those, this is the fluvial deposit and this is the gravel deposit. So they are not the sediments which were deposited by modern day Dudh Sagar or its tributaries. These are landscape, part of the landscape evolution. These are colluvial sheets, and then later when fluvial activity increased, they started depositing what we call fine-grained sediment or suspended load. Now the river has cut this down and they exposed this particular, gravel body, and we have found, in these gravels we embedded Stone Age tools and so on. So some of these large cutting tools you can see, flake scars and then the working edge and so on. And typical hand axes, large and medium size. This is a ovate. This is an elongated pointed tool with a long sharp cutting edge made from a tabular piece of quartzite. This was perhaps made from a cobble or a pebble grade quartzite. And then we have this kind of edge. This we call a cleaver. So this is intersection of two flake scars. There is one small flake scar here, and the other side, ventral side, is a long flake scar and a long flake surface. So they intersect and give rise to this kind of a working edge. We call it a cleaver. So this is a transverse cleaver, and this is a kind of a knife with a back here, and this was the cutting edge. So now, because several lakhs of years ago they were made and exposed to the surface, they have suffered some kind of weathering, alteration by natural processes. So they are not mint fresh in a way. So that also gives us an idea of their antiquity and so on. And then numerous examples along these 4 or 8 sites that we mentioned earlier have been found. These collections are in my museum, where I established a museum. I did not leave them behind anywhere. I wanted to see that they are protected and convince people as and when it is required that there are these early Paleolithic sites in Goa. They are very well documented and on display in the Robert Bruce Foote Museum in Bellary and so on. So other large flake tools that we come across with the sharp cutting edge and so on, and then the smaller tools. Even there we see the evolution from large Acheulean hand axes to smaller and smaller hand axes and so on. So this technological change also we see. And then we come across, as we come towards the western coast, see the density of sites. These are all hunter-gatherer, we call them, so now we have called them Mesolithic sites. They are hunter-gatherer, fisher, forager communities who were, widespread in this ecosystem, called coastal ecosystems, exploiting aquatic resources as well as forest food resources, and then game animals for hunting, etc. We listed some 50, and I know there are many more. There may be several hundred of these microlithic sites, and these are all, as I said, small diminutive blades, burins, and then you have backed blades, micro blades, and then triangles, trapezoids, lunates, and things like that. They were used as composite tools, and they were made from cryptocrystalline mineral rocks like chalcedony, chert, agate, and so on. They are high quality raw materials. Their efficiency is higher, their durability is also higher, and that is where we see abundant. Unfortunately, after 1994, we could not come back, and now that we have a new paradigm with respect to looking at these kind of microlithic sites, the younger generation should be able to go back and identify some intact microlithic sites. And some of those caves which we excavated may also be systematically excavated and so on. We get microlithic scatters, this kind of stone tools that we see here in the Johari Nagar area and so on, Patorpa. And then Dr. Senger of the Archaeological Survey of India in the 70s discovered some Middle Paleolithic type of tools in a site called Aradi. And then also he says there are some Neolithic tools, but then we know it is difficult to identify a Neolithic because early agricultural settlements could not could not come up in this lateritic landscape. So we see a large number of megalithic, iron very, very long. They perhaps from microlithic phase they entered into Iron Age, because laterite also gives you access to what you call limonitic pelts. That also yields some iron, but otherwise this area is also known for iron ore resources, and then developing iron metallurgy was not a challenge to these people who were adapting to this. So this is the opening mouth of the cave called Malanguinim, where we found on the floor of the cave microliths, And then it was a disturbed floor because modern day shepherds move in and around of this area. And then we thought this is a potential place, and then there were some pits already. We expanded these pits, we could go deeper, and then subsurface we could find microliths, and then animal bones along with that. So that was in the 1990s. We had a new technology for relative chronology called fluorine phosphate ratio of animal bones belonging to the buried environment and belonging to surface modern environment. So fluorine phosphate ratios between the modern animal bone and an ancient mammal bone gives us an idea of a relative age estimate for the animal bones. And these animal bones were associated with some of the trenches we dug, and then the animal bones. And Dr. Nandkumar at Deccan College, an archaeological chemist, he had developed this method called fluorine phosphate ratio estimation of bones of animals belonging to different time periods in the Pleistocene, and the standard charts were there. And when she measured the fluorine phosphate ratio of these, she could definitely tell us that at least 6,000 years ago these animal bones were, and they were hunted by these microlithic people and so on. And that is where we could establish that early late middle Holocene means about 66,000 BC time period, human hunter-gatherers were already here. But now I suspect the same cave might produce much older evidence of microlith production and adaptation in this area and so on. So we have these, these talukas, is Mongoa, Salset, Kupen, Kanapon, all these sites. We have listed these sites, nearly 50 or even more, and I'm sure there are many more. And then, as I said, we don't have clear transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic to Iron Age. So we have suddenly an outburst of megalithic sites, monuments. These are all memorials. They need not be always burial monuments. They are sepulchral as well as non-sepulchral. Sometimes they are symbolic megaliths, and sometimes there are megaliths which also contain human remains interred. So these sites are also documented in southern part of Goa, and then they give this kind of stone tools. So this is a polished axe, and that is why many archaeologists think that when they find a polished axe, it should be Neolithic, but it is not necessary. It was invented in the Neolithic, but continues into Neolithic and early historic period as well. So, but the evidence, the context in which these megaliths occur, and megaliths anywhere in India or outside, they are all Iron Age. And here your lateritic columns were established, installed during the megalithic. There are multiple types of these megaliths here. So we have these menhirs, we have stone alignments, and then this kind of pottery, red pottery, and then polished axes and so on. And then these are line drawings of these axes to convince. And then we have trilithons. They recall about what we call the famous British Stonehenge, but it's not anyway connected to it. But these are symbolic representations of the megalithic practices of the Iron Age community here. And then with these typical stone circles, these are not stones exactly, they are blocks of indurated laterite. In other parts of India, we find them used as stone blocks and so on. But here in Goa, because the source is proximal source, they could cut the blocks of this duricrust, lateritic hard crust, and then say stone circles is one of the phenomenon of megalithic burials and so on. And we have them all over. And then one of them was excavated, not by our team, previously excavated by the archaeologists here. We are not very sure, clear about what they found here. This is the way these circles are excavated into quadrants, and normally there is a chamber in the center of this circle, but we don't know whether it was exposed or not. So that is the kind of evidence that we have about the megalithic, which is abundant. And post-megalithic phase, we enter into what we call early historic time period. But an additional evidence, which was also documented and not our own discovery, it was discovered by archaeologists in Goa, and we visited them, and they have a symbolic meaning. They are not art for art's sake, and to execute this kind of a human figure on a hard lateritic surface, it requires considerable, ability to cut through incised deep, so that they are deep enough that the weathering of the laterite will not efface the whole thing. And what we have is these human forms, and this kind of human form in this lateritic bed is not unique to Goa region. They are also found in coastal Karnataka, and then Konkan, as we all know, very, very popular now, and they are now demanding World Heritage status and so on. So this entire coastal belt, Konkan to Goa to Canada, in the last couple of months, some of our students only reported this kind of geoglyphs in Karwar, coastal Karwar and so on. So this is a hermaphrodite. If you look at it very carefully, it has both male and female genitalia. We call it hermaphrodite, and these are fertility. And we are beginning to look at these symbolic features as fertility, aspect of fertility cult prevailing amongst these people. So fertility practices become very commonplace in amongst our ancient societies if they had to make sure that the landscape is productive, ensure that there is a consistent productivity of their subsistence requirements and so on. So we have these similar distributed across. There are many more I know. I would like to visit them as well. And then we, in addition to that, we have these animal engravings, geoglyphs associated with these human figures and so on. Some of them, they are stags, they are dogs, they are bulls. And bull is a very peculiar animal, which is a male fertility symbol amongst these early agricultural communities. We see this right from Southwest Asia to the Neolithic and Iron Age of various parts of South India. And bull is male fertility, and then we have the female, Venus in the form of terracotta figurines in other parts of subcontinent. But perhaps the ones I showed you, they are the female divinities associated with the fertility cult and so on. This is a typical Jebu, humped bull, and they are frequently seen in the context of megalithic and Neolithic sites across the Indian subcontinent. The suspected dog engraving, and this labyrinth is very, very common. So this is much more symbolic perspectives. They are known in terms of structures like Gobekli and so on. But in India and even in Latin America, we have these features. Some people say wherever you see these labyrinths, the possibility of striking groundwater are high. And then some people say if there are diseases which cannot be cured, and if you circumambulate into these labyrinth, there's a cure or something like that. But why I call this not Neolithic but Iron Age is because we have similar labyrinths in mainland peninsula, and they are sitting on top of ash mounds, which are definitely Neolithic. So the post-ash mound period is Iron Age in South India, and here similar feature reflected in the lateritic surface happens to be Iron Age. Of course, as I said, without a very strong iron chisel, you cannot cut through this kind of rock formation. Although it is a fossil soil, we call it rock. It's a bedrock as our requirement is. So these are different views, and we also have these footprints engraved in near this. So there is a relationship. You have to articulate these two features together and see what they do, what do they symbolize. I have yet to go into the details of these features. Only now I have begun to look back, although we documented, revisited many of them 40 years ago. Until the Konkan geoglyphs drew our attention, we were not looking carefully at these. Now I am beginning to look back and see if I can understand their significance in the context of the time they were produced and so on. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer the questions.
I was basically obsessed with the human curiosity to know our past. Human mind is always curious to know what is in the past, and in the present context, most of us wants to know our past in search of identity. In a formal days in schools and colleges, most of us are not interested in history. Prehistory is a very, very technical and specialized kind of a thing. But even in history, we are not interested. As we grow old, most of us in this group are, I can see elderly people. As we grow old, actually, yes, our curiosity about the past, it increases. As the present speaker has made it very clear on that for migrations, invasions, but initially the migrations. And these migrations, as of us who are now here sitting or on this planet. Now, if you're talking about Goa particularly or India, what we are today, it's definitely a hybrid mix, genetically, culturally, and even linguistically, because linguistic is an important subject for Goa. It's all hybrid mix. I mean, any search for a purity, in most of us we do that even now. It's all illusion. He never said that, but I can draw from his conclusions. But then the question comes, not on prehistory, I am on history. Why history matters? And why we should study history? If you ask me, when I was sitting there, if somebody asked me, you come for this lecture, after listening to his lecture, whether I will be curious to read some basic books on a prehistory, and why we should do that? Now, that's a common question for me. Normally, for history, not on a prehistory, a general perception, the general expectation of people is, if you study history, it can help you to understand your mistakes in the present, or it can give you some lessons for the present. But again, there's a problem. The major philosophers, and one of the philosophers, most of us, you may know, Hegel, the German philosopher, he said it very clearly. The only lesson what we learn from the history is that we don't learn anything at all. We keep on repeating the mistakes. And the most important thinker, political thinker, Marx said that we repeat our mistakes first as a tragedy and then as a farce. In historical sense, Marx was one of the major political thinkers, but he also interpreted history. And while interpreting history, he followed a method. I'm not talking the method which they are following in archaeology. In social science, what he followed a method, that method, understanding events of a long time, why this happened. Now that method influenced both Europe, America, and even our Indian historians. They have adopted that method, and I personally feel that that method and Marx as a philosopher, historical thinker, is still relevant while understanding the history. Second question comes is, and that's very critical for the modern times now, a lot of people feel that studying history gives us some identity.
Professor Korisettar came to our Shilpalok. I have a sculpture studio in Verna, and we made several sculptures. In Rajbhavan, Nataraja is made by us. Yeah, and many 50-60 Bhavan temples adored our sculpture. I was a marine archaeologist from the National Institute of Oceanography, and Dr. Shettar is, he used to come to NIO. Yeah, and I was a team member of Dwarka underwater excavations. I worked about 15 years, about 1,200 hours I dived in the Dwarka waters and all. I was a main team member. And 1981 I got Indian Science Academy Fellowship in NIO. That time Dr. S.R. Ravi was there. I was the first research fellow in marine archaeology. Dr. Korisettar. And go on. Okay.
I call upon Mrs. Devi Shilkre to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Center for Study of Mythology and Culture, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who have gathered here for today's enlightening session. First and foremost, I would like to express my deepest thanks to our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Ravi Korisettar, for his profound and insightful talk on the prehistory of Goa. Have left us enriched and inspired. I'm also grateful to Havaldarji, who presided over this session with his valuable insights and for his contribution to the discussion. Your presence has added depth and significance to the event, sir. A special word of appreciation to our friends from the media played a pivotal role in ensuring that today's lecture reaches the wider public. To the staff, to the support staff of the Department of Art and Culture, thank you for the flawless technical support and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Thanks to Dadoshi caterers today who kept us happy with their refreshments, Anand Enterprises for their printing services. Most importantly, my colleague Dr. Shefali Kale, who was the master of ceremonies today. When we approached Dr. Shefali, she immediately agreed and she did a wonderful job today.